Welcome back to the Demystify Psi podcast. I'm Anastasia.
I'm Shiloh.
And today we are talking about the biofield. With us for this conversation, we have Dr. Shamani Jain, whose career has been kind of incredible. So she started her career as a researcher in psychoneuroimmunology. She still serves as an adjunct professor at UCSD, but most of her attention these days is put into her Consciousness and Healing Initiative, a nonprofit organization that she runs to spread knowledge and information and to build a community around the ideas of biofields, of healing, and of integrative medicine. And on its face, this is a topic that is often dismissed as being very woo, right? Like you hear healers all the time talking about, quantum energy and the various spiritualist and spooky aspects.
Even the word energy by itself.
I know, and we don't really dig into the topic of energy in this conversation because we've learned over the course of doing many of these conversations that diving into the specific...
Even with physicists, diving into the concept of energy is too much.
Exactly. And so I think that the best representation of what we're talking about is the idea that health and well-being is not limited to the physical body. There is an enormous component of it that appears to be spiritual, and it appears to also be founded in community and cohesion of groups. And so Shamani's been working on this for a really long time.
Cohesion of self, too?
Yeah, deeply, deeply. It starts with the cohesion of self from Dr. Jain's perspective and ends with progressively reaching out to larger and larger structures in the world and in society. And it's an endlessly fascinating topic for me because I think that as scientists, we tend to come at these topics from a very materialist lens, which is that there are molecules bumping around doing things. And if we can't come up with a molecular and biophysical explanation for how something like acupuncture works or energy healing works like reiki and these sorts of touch meditations, then they must not be real. But, from our conversation with Dean Radin and from our conversation with Shamani, it's pretty apparent that there are effects. They might not be, massive, but they are persistent, they are present, and they are valuable. And so we spent today trying to untangle what this is, how it affects people, and the practices that can be put into place to actually make it something that's part of your life.
And if we seem overly chill right now, it's because the conversation ended with a meditation session of some sort, and it was very rejuvenating, and so we are overly centered at the moment. Anyways, remember guys, if you enjoy this podcast, consider keeping it going. Giving just a couple of dollars a month goes a long ways. We have a lot of patrons, but we could always use more. We can always expand this project and put more time towards it, and we need your help to do that. We don't sell anything. We plan to keep it that way. So come on over, check out patreon.com/demystifypsi. We get together once a week all together and chop it up about all our favorite topics. I'd love to see you there. If you don't have any money right now, maybe you will later, that's fine. You can definitely tell someone about this podcast. You can give us a good review. All these things result in us getting better and better guests on the show, and it doesn't cost you a thing. So give it a like, give it a subscribe, do these tiny little tasks that help us reach more people and grow the show. And we'll really, really appreciate it. It's extremely meaningful to us to be able to make a more powerful project out of this. So check out Patreon or just share the podcast with somebody who would enjoy it.
And if you like Shamani's presentation and you want to hear more about her ideas, she's got a book out that's called Healing Ourselves, and she's also a badass musician, and she has a phenomenal album out called Kali Yuga Blues. It's on Spotify, Apple Music, wherever. And so if you want to hear what she's doing when she's not working on biofield and healing and consciousness initiatives, check out Kali Yuga Blues.
Yeah, we have people on the show sometimes who dabble in music, but this is legit. It's a really dope album. Check it out. And enjoy the conversation. We'll see you guys next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
Demystify Psi podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
How have you been? You've been on the road too, huh?
I just got back in last night. Good. I mean, the travel is kind of like, ugh, but it's so rewarding, to be able
Mm.
to do what we get to do. So very grateful for that. And, well-received messages, excitement for practices and what we're doing with the initiative, the Consciousness and Healing Initiative. So that's all really great.
What were you presenting? Can you remind me?
I had a cute few things at both of these conferences. So I did Donna Eden. I think I mentioned her to you. She's an amazing healer. Um, and her husband, David Feinstein, also a wonderful healer, psychologist, and scientist. So they had their conference in Tucson, and then I did another one in New Mexico this weekend, and kind of similar flow. Keynote on what I call, and I think we can touch on that a little bit today, perhaps. I'm just sort of framing the data and this whole area of biofield and what the data is telling us, what it means in terms of a framework of, what does it truly mean to move from chaos to co-creation or co-evolution? And what is the role of the biofield in that? And what is the data telling us? So that's kind of more of the keynote. And then the workshop is your healing voice, which I know you guys resonate with. And, I think I talked with y'all a little bit about that last time in terms of what my flow is. And again, man, it's so gratifying to see people come into their voice and really connect with their energy and sort of feel a little bit more grounded in themselves and empowered.
Mm.
A lot of what I see is just folks that feel shut down with their voice in some way, not being able to sort of be in their own authority or
Like their physical voice, like their speaking voice.
I mean,
Yeah.
part of it is it's all a reflection, right? I mean, to me the voice is just it's a reflection of consciousness. So when someone is afraid to use their voice, which most of us are, obviously singing performance, that's about like, kind of being in the limelight or whatever, not wanting a lot of attention on you. And that's okay. Like you don't need to do that. Like, but if you feel like you can't speak in a situation or you're struggling with, there's usually two ways it shows up, right? For people, for most all of us, and both often for most of us, which is I can't get a word in edgewise, or this person is steamrolling me with their energy or their anger or whatever it is. And like, I feel frozen and I can't speak up. Or I'm the fiery one and I don't know how, it's just the communication. The voice is a tool for communication. And so how do you work with the voice in a way that you can harmonize a relationship or a situation? So we work a little bit on the speaking, but mostly I have them making sound,
Mm.
just like what does earth feel like in your voice, and what does it mean to bring water in your voice, and then how can you bring that into a situation? And then we obviously do some singing and chanting too to just get, but it's more like in the spirit of play rather than performance.
Mm. It took me a really long time to realize there was certain people, certain of my friends that took being interrupted really well. Like I used to feel more on the passive, like I felt like people were steamrolling me a lot, or like they didn't care about my perspective or something, or they weren't asking me questions. But I realized that just certain ones of my friends, you have to just dive right in, like cut them off in the middle of a sentence, and they like that. They actually respond well to that. That took me years to understand, and as soon as I figured that out, my whole life got a lot easier, because I feel like you can identify those types too, and that's great. There's people who just charge up the world with their extroversion and their ideas at all times, and that's a good thing, but you just have to learn how to work with them. And so
Not take it personally, but speaking from a family who interrupts constantly, and I do it all the time without even realizing. And my husband has constantly like, kind of like, dude, I don't know if you realize this, and he'll say it really lovingly and stuff. He's like, I don't know if you realize this, but like I can't get a word in edgewise, and I feel like you're not listening, you're just talking. So I've learned too that I appreciate what you're saying. And I also feel like for those of us who do interrupt a lot, like our lesson is to ground our energy so that we can really listen and not just be in our heads all the time.
I love this way. One of the gentlemen we had on the show, he's a scholar at Columbia. I forget what his specialty is exactly, but he wrote a blog. His name's Adam Mastroianni, and he's trying to analyze what the best types of conversations are. And he references comedy improv as a good example of the way that a good conversation should go, because what happens, I don't know if you've ever seen these comedy improvs, but people essentially will pause someone in the middle of a of a skit, and then they'll pick up the characters in the skit and take it in a completely new direction. And then someone will they'll call pause or something, and the characters will swap out, and someone else will pick up right there. And so he has this method he calls the doorknob method, where you're essentially looking for doorknobs into topics that relate to the ones before, not necessarily that everybody's just kind of taking turns speaking their mind, but you actually have this interactive opening of doors because you see a door all of a sudden into something that excites you, which is in relation to what was exciting them, and you eventually get this resonance building up.
That's cool. Yeah, I haven't really looked into comedy improv. That sounds really neat.
I mean, it's interesting because I also hear people really express a great dislike of that style. Like, there's certain types of people
it can be terrible
that just want to be listened to, and I think that's a place where, you know, I've encountered this idea that in conversation, when somebody's constantly when somebody says something, and the other person is like, "Oh, that's interesting. That makes me think of this," they actually feel like they're not being listened to, because what they want is they want the space to be able to just lay out the ideas and have the person ask them direct questions about their experience, as opposed to sharing something of their own experience. And that's deeply foreign to me, because I resonate with the improv comedy style of just, where are all the doorknobs? Where can this go? Help me develop the idea, push it somewhere new. And I imagine that I probably drive people crazy that want to just be asked deep questions about themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, I think most people don't feel listened to. That's what it is.
So how does
They
this
don't feel heard.
interact?
And especially with the healer community, you know, that's part of the medicine that we're trying to bring to them, is they're afraid to speak sometimes about their work because of feeling like they're going to get ridiculed, or people aren't going to understand, and they feel like they have to hide, and you know that what they're doing isn't real and all that. So a lot of what I end up doing is being like, you know, and I'm really being, I my title for my talk these days, and I think it's really important. I'm literally calling it the 6 C's, why healers lead the future. Because I want them to really own that, you know, and be able to like sit in their grounding and be like, yeah, this is what I do. And here's the science behind it. Here's what we don't know, but this is how it works.
What do you mean by healer?
And
What's a healer versus a doctor, or something that people might be more familiar with?
yeah, I mean, like, well, now when I say healer in this case, I'm talking about like the biofield healing folks, the folks that are really working with energy and spirit, you know, not that doctors don't do that or can't do that, or nurses and whatever, but it's with the respect to this particular area that is non-material, when they're really like their point of focus in the work that they're doing is to really open up those realms and work with those realms, because they're invisible and they're met with such skepticism, right? Even doctors who work that way won't talk about that word. That's like, we got to get out of the closet, you know?
Yeah, what's up with that? Why do you think there's so little healing vibes in a hospital setting? Like we were just talking last night, I had this terrible experience where I had to have this surgery on my nose, like, because I couldn't breathe maybe 5 years ago. And it was just like one of the most awful, traumatic, non-caring, brutal, sterile, horrible environments.
It's the managed care system. It's because money is driving the system, not caring.
Is there a way out of that? Like, do you see a future where the two can be integrated? I mean, because obviously surgery is often a really good thing, but
yeah, totally. It's supposed to be whole person. The way out of like the current system is dependent on whether or not we're going to keep moving with the managed care system as it is, right? But if we are, then the only thing they're going to listen to is the bottom line in their view, which is the money. So that's where the studies like are important, because when you start showing cost effectiveness and you can show them that they're actually going to save money, that they don't need to be attached to like a drug to mitigate chronic pain, but if they were to actually get energy healing pre-op, post-op, you know, that kind of thing, that the outcomes are going to be better, less time in the hospital, less use of medications, are going to save money. So the science lever becomes really important for integrating whole person care into the hospital and clinical systems if they're going to remain the way they are. And then there's a question of whether you want to just dismantle the whole system and do it differently.
Can you define managed care for me really quickly?
Yeah, I mean, it's the term that is typically used, right, in hospitals and many clinics, where it's the insurance companies that are running the show, right? I mean, think about that. Managed care, right? And some people like to say the sick care system, not the healthcare system. But look, I mean, it's all based on consumer demand. It's research because you got to have the evidence base, and then it's consumer demand. It's that simple. If it's like, oh, we don't like your insurance policy, we like the insurance policy that gives us this preventative care like chiropractic and acupuncture that'll keep us well. So that could be part of managed care, right? We're managing your care so that you don't get sick. That could be. But right now, it's like this system, right? Certain people can bill for certain things. You can't bill for certain things. In most systems, you can't bill for things like Reiki, and all of that is out of pocket. So a lot of the questions become, okay, how do we make this accessible to everyone? Like if these kinds of therapies can't be covered by insurance, then they have to be paid for out of pocket or in the community setting. How are we going to scale that? But I'm no expert in public health, but I do feel like there are multiple ways that we can intervene. And it's said time and time again for all kinds of integrative practices, and certainly for things like meditation and energy healing and whatever. We want to prevent disease before it gets into the physical system anyway. So, yes, there's no doubt the evidence will tell us that biofield therapies are helpful for hospitalized patients, and we should be giving it to folks in the hospital. But there's also a place for this kind of work and the self-care, right? Because to me, that's what it's ultimately about. Like, if the biofield is teaching us that we have this amazing ability to connect with our energy in every moment and regulate our health, then the more we do that, the less we're going to get sick. So are we managing ourselves? Is managed care like, kind of
I think that's the
managing
most that's the
self-care?
most hopeful part is taking it into your own hands, because I feel like even if the insurance companies find that they can save money, there's almost like two arms pushing back and forth, and the other one is the pharmaceutical industry, which wants to make those drugs the primary source of treatment of patients. And so they're pushing just as hard on the system. But I feel like we can actually, like you said, if we can keep ourselves out of the health management system as long as possible, that's probably our best hope. Like, I had this actually when we were on Maui just now. Anastasia begged me to go to this back healer guy, because I've had I fell on a carabiner when I was climbing many years ago, and yeah, but it was awesome, and this guy was actually amazing. Shout out to Paul at what is it, Sport Bodywork. Shout out to Paul. But one of the things he said to me, which is relevant, was at each juncture, he was like, he was asking me, how do you play guitar? And I showed him. And, of course I'm hunched over looking at the fretboard. He's like, you don't have to do that. He's like, have you ever seen AC/DC? I'm like, oh, not really. He's like, that guy's running all over the stage playing guitar,
Yes.
staring. Yeah. And I'm like, I definitely can play without looking, but he's like, it's your choice. He's like, how do you hold your phone? I showed him. He's like, you can hold it up here, and it's your choice. And so at each juncture, he was really forcing me to realize that I am making these little decisions all day long about my health, and it's totally in my hands, but it requires that attention and recentering yourself and refocusing.
But I think that it goes a little bit deeper than that too, because from what I've seen, I feel like healthcare for people is in some ways a return to the womb, a return to the loving embrace of a parent, of somebody.
Especially if you have really good insurance.
Especially if you have really good, well, that's the hope, right? So we have a friend who has really, really good insurance. And he said that he went to go see a doctor for something, and he was stunned because he came back from it and he said that he hadn't felt cared for like that since he was a kid and his parents were caring for him. And the doctors were so good, and he felt so seen and heard. And
this is like Fortune 500 CEO insurance level,
But, everybody else goes to the doctor. And Shiloh has this experience where he went to go see somebody about, what is it that you were getting in?
I had a deviated septum surgery.
No, I was thinking about the dermatologist.
Oh my God.
He goes to see this dermatologist, and the guy basically walks in with the prescription already written without having looked at him, hands him the prescription, and just walks out.
Oh, yeah. So, look, you just saw the two extremes there, right? And we're talking about managed care or whatever. What is that? And what you described, not Shiloh, not your experience, but what you described, I am so sorry, Anastasia? right? Okay, Anastasia. Like that takes me back to actually what started like my whole journey with the first study that I ever did with energy healing for fatigue breast cancer survivors. And in a nutshell, it was my experience following this incredible doctor. And his name is Dan Vicario. He's actually on the board of the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, our nonprofit. And I've known him for decades now, right? So this was when I was at UCSD, UC San Diego. He was at UC San Diego. And I was looking for an oncologist to basically refer patients to this study, right? We're doing this far out study in energy healing at UCSD. No one's ever done it before. I've got to find a doctor who might be willing to tell patients about the study. So I went to him with this agenda, right? I was like, okay, talked with him. I had known that he was this amazing, integratively minded doctor. And I told him about the study we wanted to do in energy healing. And he just looked at me and he said, how about you like shadow me for a day with my patients? Because he wanted me to kind of understand what it was all about. Like I came in with my agenda, the study, we're going to look at energy healing, it's going to be great. And I followed him for a day and I learned about like what I believe the future is really of healing in healthcare for doctors, and all those who were coming into this so-called managed care system. Because what he did with those patients when I followed him that day, it was just tremendous. He was fully present. He was so caring, like you're saying, Anastasia, like the mother energy was just so there. The touch on the shoulder, the deep listening, the caring, the love, and these are your options. This is the diagnosis. Here are all the things you can do. But with that was kind of I believe in you. I trust in you. Here are all the ways that we can support you. What are all the other ways that you think you have support? Where do you lack support? Like it was so beautiful and so deep, but more than anything, it was the energy that he carried, honestly. And I got it. I was like, well, this study in energy healing is going to be tremendous, but this is what we're going for right here. Is like, can we feel that capacity in every single provider to know that their presence matters, the way they interact matters, and their doctors, unfortunately, in the managed care system as it exists right now, like you said, not everyone has concierge medicine where they have the luxury of being able to spend an hour and a half with a patient, right? So when you're in a managed care system where it's like, I got to meet my quotas, I've got 15 minutes, here's your prescription, that's what we end up with. So again, like if we're looking for healthcare, then it's that we have to reprioritize. Is it impact over income? Can it be both? Like, if you don't believe in scarcity mentality, then it absolutely can be both, because we know that people that are doing concierge medicine are making money, right? It's not that they aren't. And if we can reduce like the suffering and the need to rely on a sick care system, you can make money preventing sickness. So all these things can go together, right? But it's like, it's a mindset shift. And look, I just want to say this one thing. These companies are interested in making money. Nestle has bought up Pure Encapsulations, which is a supplement company, a very well-known company in functional medicine. They're investing in bioelectromagnetic medicine. They're going to go wherever the patient demand is. That it's really that simple. They're a typical corporate that just they were focused on bottom line of income. That's how they think. So as long as they can make money and save money, they're going to be in.
What about the pharmaceutical side of things?
Well, that's what I'm saying. They're reinvesting now. I think a lot of them are rethinking, like, okay, if people don't want to buy chemical drugs, what do they want to buy? Oh, they'll buy supplements. There's such a market for supplements. Can we sell? They just want to sell stuff, right? Can we sell supplements? Bayer has invested in self-care practices. Like they're going to go where the demand is. It's that simple.
I like that. I hope so.
In power,
I like that
I really
perspective.
hope you're right about that.
So can we give kind of an overview of biofield medicine for people?
Yeah. Look, biofield is a westernized term. It's fields of energy and information that guide our health. I like to tell people the history of the term. It was really coined in the 90s by a group of scientists who were brought together at the National Institutes of Health, because they were trying to figure out how they grokked the scientific data and what they could call this as a larger field. They were looking at studies in acupuncture. They were looking at studies with devices like pulsed electromagnetic field stimulation. They were looking at data with what we call subtle energy healing practices like Tai Chi and Qigong and energy healing. And they said, okay, in all of these different ways, whether you can measure these energies or whether you can't, all of these practitioners are saying they're working with energy in some way. In some ways measurable, in some ways not. But honestly, even with things like, non-invasive brain stimulation, which is practically mainstream, you can measure the energies going into the body and the brain, but you don't really fully understand what's happening in the body. They've done studies, but you can't trace, what happens when energy comes into the cranium and how exactly it's dissipating and making the effects. You can just measure downstream effects, right? So it's the same thing with energy healing and acupuncture. So they got together and started calling this data, and they said, okay, what do these things have in common? How could we describe this as sort of an area? And they came up with this term biofield. And the description that they came up with was something like this: fields of energy and information, not a massless field, not necessarily electromagnetic, that guides the homeodynamic functioning of a living organism, because they were seeing these effects on cells and in animals and in people. So they're looking, and even in plants, right? So they're looking at this from like sort of a living systems point of view, and they're trying to create this umbrella term. So that means biofield science is actually pretty broad, because biofield science includes things like looking at electromagnetic changes across cell membranes and their ability to grow new neural tissue. Now, you know about the work of Mike Levine, right, at Tufts University. That aspect could be called part of biofield science. But studying things like energy healing is also part of biofield science, because here you can look at things that you can't quite measure directly. People are trying or exploring that, right? But there are different kinds of healers working with people, with cells, and in animals, with incredible data emerging, I'd say emerging data. A lot more we want to kind of explore about this, where we're seeing these real effects of even things like energy healing on patient outcomes, like reductions of pain, reductions of fatigue, but shifts in physiology, improved natural killer cell cytotoxicity in cancer patients receiving healing touch, regulations in hormone function for fatigued breast cancer survivors getting energy healing. And then, I've talked to you guys about this before because I'm so excited about it. Some of the emerging work at MD Anderson Cancer Center, few studies already published, more on the way, profound effects of energy healing on cancer cell spread or metastasis in the body, down to shifts in inflammatory cytokines, down to shifts in cell subsets, protein kinase signaling, PD-L1 expression on cells, basically drilling down into the cellular, quote, mechanisms. Love to talk about mechanism. That even these fields that we can't measure are having profound effects on our emotional, mental, and spiritual health, but also on our physical health. And we don't understand exactly how it works, but we can measure those downstream effects, including in cells and in animals, which is what MD Anderson Cancer Center is doing. And man, I wish I could tell you more. I really want you to interview Dr. Lorenzo Cohen, who is doing this groundbreaking work at MD Anderson Cancer Center, because he's been in this for decades. He's very well positioned. He had to get internal review boards at MD Anderson Cancer Center and external review boards outside of MD Anderson Cancer Center just to get permission to do this work, even though he got the funding. And the level of scrutiny, it's great. We want best science, like endless replications of the data. This isn't like a one-off thing that they've been doing with this incredible work demonstrating different kinds of biofield healing, energy healing, as people like to call it, different practitioners, different types, like replicating these findings on the spread of cancer in the body and the physiology behind it. I mean, it's so mind-blowing to the current scientific paradigm that they're having a really hard time with it, honestly. And now he's kind of going through the next Herculean effort to get these studies published in top medical and science journals where they belong. Because this is profound, right? To me, it's like this demonstrates the power of consciousness and its relationship with matter, including our bodies. Incredible.
Do you think that this is in some way an extension of a type of meditative practice where it's the external actor is able to take something that they're concentrating within their own mind and then externalize it to the patient? Or do you think that it's a totally different phenomenon?
Anastasia, I love that question. Look, and I don't know why I'm having hesitation. Is it Anastasia or Anastasia?
So it's technically Anastasia with a soft S.
Anastasia. Okay, thank you. And I should have asked you that earlier, so I apologize. Anastasia, that question is so important because I think a lot of people don't understand what energy healing is. And I feel like you really hit the nail on the head. I feel like this is what I would call a transpersonal contemplative practice, honestly, because whatever traditions these healers are coming from, and there are so many, like from ancient indigenous healing perspectives and from modern healing perspectives, but they're all kind of describing to me a process that's similar. They, first of all, ground, which means they get into their bodies, right? They're actually not like leaving their bodies. They're not dissociating. I mean, some shamans do, of course, but these like more these practices like healing touch and Reiki and pranic healing that folks are doing in the clinics and the hospitals, that's not honestly their practice. They're not leaving their bodies in any way. They get really grounded and embodied, but they also let go. So it's similar to meditation in that they're grounding in presence, but they're also releasing the conditioned mind in a way and just allowing for presence to sort of sink in and direct the sensory experience in some way. So, there's so many different kinds of contemplative traditions, and I don't want to try to lump them all into one bucket and say that they're all like energy healing at all. I mean, there's some real differences. Vipassana, this, you don't do anything, right? You're just in awareness, for example. So that contemplative tradition, there's no intention. So the main difference here is an intention. The initial practice is similar, coming into the body, noting sensation, releasing the conditioned egoic mind, and allowing yourself to be a conduit. And that's where the shift is. So once you allow yourself to be a conduit, then you're being an instrument in a way. You're like feeling into, in this case, with energy healing, most energy healing practices, you're feeling into the field in some way. So there's an intentional part of it there where I'm connecting in with my subtle awareness and this connection between me and this other being to feel into their field and notice where there are areas of disconnect, of stuckness, right? And there comes the intentional aspect of it for most of them, where it's like, let me see what happens if I tune into the stuckness and I try to remove the stuckness. But they're very clear with me. I keep saying healer, but they don't like the term. They're like, I'm not a healer. I'm not doing the healing. They're healing themselves. I'm just trying to remove the obstacles that might be in the way so that they can come into a deeper sense of their higher self and their what they call their higher self, their spirit, their soul, consciousness can write their healing response. In science, we call that salutogenesis, the process of healing. Right. So, from the healing practitioner's perspective, they're basically fostering the process of innate salutogenesis or the ability to heal oneself. And that's really how they see it.
I mean, can I just like give a shout out to our hardcore materialists in the audience too? Because I think a lot of this stuff can come off as sounding really mystical and spooky and let's say non-scientific, and that's not quite the right word, but what I want to point out is that the reality of the situation, I've said this before, and it's worth repeating on this show, that your body, you often think of it as this isolated system, but the reality is that without the trees making the air for you to breathe outside, you can't exist. And so it is in some sense a fallacy to think of yourself as separate from your environment. And it sounds to me like, and the same goes, if you put someone in isolation, they'll die. Like you can't live without other people. It destroys people's souls and minds and eventually their bodies. We really are physically connected to our environments and to our social environments. We're very much consciously connected to them. And so the idea that you're going to address people's health by adjusting and coming to understand their connectivity to their environments and how that might be severed or bottled up in different ways is a completely reasonable, rational approach. I think that the term energy healing throws people off because what you're really doing is reconnecting people to the world in some sense, or to themselves, even to their own bodies. And so
Yeah.
I just want to put down any naysayers right away and remind them that they can't exist without the trees outside. So how disconnected are we really,
To that end, I wonder how similar a practitioner in a hospital who's doing this sort of practice is to some kind of immersion in beautiful restorative nature. Because I feel like nature, being in the woods, being somewhere beautiful, being somewhere that isn't
in the ocean.
being in the ocean, somewhere that hasn't been, strip mined and covered in concrete, is also a very restorative practice. And I wonder if there's overlaps there where it's something that you can induce through this meditative contemplative practice in a similar way that happens when you get to go into some of these environments that are very beautiful and calming.
I agree with you. I think a lot of this is about the level of granularity or subtlety that we're examining the human experience with. And I love, Shiloh, that you said you can spiritualize this if you want, but you really don't have to, because what we're talking about here are field effects, right? And we're just not used to thinking about things in field effects. We have grown up in a particular paradigm where we've been looking at the body like a discrete level, just sort of like discrete things. And now we're learning that those discrete things may talk to each other. And look, I really want to shout this out because my home field of psychoneuroimmunology was non-existent about 50 or 60 years ago. And the idea that emotions could affect our health, including, our immune system, was laughed at because we didn't understand that the brain and the immune system were deeply connected. That's material. Like we can look at the material reality of that. We just didn't think that way. We weren't thinking from a systems point of view. This is system science. That is literally what we're talking about. So whether we talk about it in terms of person to person connection and opening to a field that can help regenerate the body, or we go into nature to do that, its nature is transpersonal. And I believe what you're saying is so valuable because there is something about the mind when it links into that self-referential loop, and we know this from studying the default mode network, right? So when we look at default mode network activity, and we see that that can be inhibited by when we get quiet, when we engage in practices like meditation. I don't know if there have been studies looking at the default mode network in nature, but there should be, right? It's just a shift in the field, okay? That's a shift in the field that you can actually measure. You're measuring shifts in brain waves. And the sense of self in connection with that shift in the field, there is a correlation there. And there are studies with that in meditation, right? That the shifts in our sense of who we are and our connection with people shifts when the field shifts. And we can measure some of those field shifts. But I think what throws the materialists off are, how do we measure these field shifts? So there are people that are trying to do that. But look, we're just beginning to explore this. And honestly, part of this is that we haven't really considered how we might be able to apply thinking in physics to biology, those frameworks. And so this is where people start beginning to talk about the quantum body. And are there ways to begin to explore behavior and physiology that might make more sense from a quantum-based perspective versus a classical physics-based perspective, right? So there's a lot of exploration that needs to happen, but yet, and I know, oh my God, quantum, hand wavy, here we go, like I get it because in growing up as a young scientist, when people started talking about things like energy healing from a quantum-based perspective, I was like, oh, here we go. Here's the hand waving, no evidence for that. And yet the data is mounting that we can see quantum-like behavior in macroscopic systems, that behavior like the homing of birds, can actually be explained better from an entanglement point of view than the classical physics point of view. So a lot of this is just about perspective.
And in some ways, observation as well, right? Because what is meditation if not directed observation? And a system that is observed and paid attention to changes its tendencies and its habits. And so I hear what you're saying about I think that when quantum starts to get thrown around, it can be really immaterial in many ways. I do feel like it's a place where we don't really understand entanglement in
Fields in general.
fields in general. And so it's like adding something that is poorly understood to something else that's poorly understood seems like it compounds the problem rather than makes it better. And there's a tendency, what is it?
I was just going to say, but the most generous thing that we can absolutely say from the empirical evidence is that all of this quantum research is telling us that these atoms, at least, are connected to their environment, right? They're connected to one another across great distances, even through whatever mechanism that we haven't figured out yet. But we do see a reinforcement of that idea that there is interconnectivity between physical bodies, and that's fascinating.
And that attention changes systems. And I think that that's the fundamental, which is that if you're going through the world and you're discombobulated by either a cancer treatment or stress or whatever depression, difficulties of life that weigh on you, it's very difficult to get into a space where you're able to pay attention to what's actually happening well enough to shift the direction of the system. But obviously the studies that have been done on meditators, on people like Wim Hof, the stuff that Dean Radin's been doing, we just talked to Dean Radin, and his results are crazy because he's building these, he's a parapsychology researcher he worked at Bell Labs, he worked briefly for the CIA, he worked at the Stanford Research Institute, and he's like, it's crazy because we can build these quantum systems and show that when you think about the system, it changes the baseline of the reading of the machine.
Yeah, the negativity. Dean is a dear friend of mine. He serves on our Consciousness and Healing Initiative Scientific Advisory Council. I've known him for decades. And it was actually his work, along with Marilyn Schlitz, which was very, very provocative to help us try to understand could there be such a thing as so-called distant healing? Because back in the day, he and Marilyn did these very carefully controlled experiments at the Institutes of Noetic Sciences where they demonstrated that someone could distantly intend to affect the physiology of someone else in a completely different room, and in some cases separated by a great amount of space, not in the same building, nothing. And in these sort of on-off periods, typical of how we would do cognitive psychology experiments with someone with a computer, right? Baseline conditions, not telling the receiver when they were going to be intended for, all of that. All of this is published, right? Like dozens of trials that they have done in this. They could demonstrate that distant intention could affect the physiology of another human being. And and this brings us back to, how does that work? Like the best example that we currently have is entanglement, right? But again, do we understand it? No, it's very difficult to talk about it. Have we laid out the experiments to demonstrate that human to human could be what's happening? No. Is it plausible given the limited data that we have? Is it a better possible explanation than saying it doesn't exist when we're seeing that distant healing can actually help people? So, ultimately, I come to this as a clinician, first and foremost. I'm super pragmatic, and I've done my own studies on, is this all placebo, right? That was what my whole randomized control trial at UCSD was about. Was can we explain these energy healing effects from placebo elements? And honestly, in that particular study, we couldn't. And in many studies, we haven't been able to demonstrate that it's just placebo, although placebo itself is powerful. Maybe we can dig into that. But I want to name one other perspective here that I think is important. And I want to give a shout out to my dear colleague, Neil Teese. I don't know if y'all know Neil. He is someone that you should really interview as well. You would love him. He's amazing. Among other things, he was one of the scientists recently. He's a pathologist and a professor at Mount Sinai, in New York. He was one of the folks who demonstrated empirically the existence of the body-wide interstitium. So we're used to thinking about interstitial fluid around cells, but they demonstrated that there's actually a fluid-filled cavity throughout the body that is the body-wide interstitium, and that it appears to have provocative relevance to things like cancer spread and potentially integrative health interventions like acupuncture and even potentially energy healing. Neil is also a Buddhist meditator, and he is a deep scientist and thinker in the area of complexity. So he's written a beautiful book, which I recommend to everyone. I know I should be plugging my own, but I'm going to plug Neil's book first, which is Notes on Complexity. Such a beautiful, easy read. It won the Nautilus Award this year, I think. And he talks about how we can explore medicine and biology at different levels of scale. I really feel that if we want to understand these so-called mystical or foreign, I'll even throw that word out because, again, I truly feel like monocultural ethnocentrism has dominated Western medicine for so long and really stymied the effects of clinical care. Because it is rooted in materialism, and honestly, you could say that materialism is a byproduct of monocultural ethnocentrism or colonialism. We can go there if you guys want to go there, but there's if you want to explore this from a complex systems point of view and explore the nature of complexity and what it is telling us about living systems, taking that kind of approach to these so-called, woo-woo practices may bring it more from woo to true for some folks, because you've really got to look at the evidence, and we've just got to shift our perspective to understand why these things work, because they are working. I mean, they are working. So we, as scientists, ought to figure out, like, instead of just dismissing it and saying, I don't believe this data because it doesn't fit my model of thinking, we should be like, this is interesting. There seems to be an effect that we don't understand. How might we shift our perspective to understand why things like this seem to be having effects down to cellular signaling?
Can I ask you how you're personally implementing this in your own well-being and health? I mean, you seem like you look really healthy. I mean, I don't know, like, I'm not trying to embarrass you or anything, but you look fantastic. You seem like you've been putting this to use in your own life, and I'm curious what your own, like, daily practices are like. Do you meditate? Do you play music? Like, what are you doing?
Thank you. Well, first, I am, I feel really grateful to be doing the work that I'm doing. And, sometimes I know we all go through this, right? Anything you do, even if you do it with passion, if you don't do it in a sustainable way, it can be exhausting. So I really am monitoring that in this time in my life. I just turned 50 this year, and my energy is changing. And as a result, I'm deepening my sadhana. There are three pillars that sometimes people talk about. Um, in and I will be unabashedly say that I am unabashedly spiritual. I'm an unabashed spiritual scientist. So I do connect with the field on a daily basis. And my practice is meditation, it's singing, it's being in nature. And these days, really trying to do my best to sort of sit in my body and, like, really just breathe in when I feel like my mind is spinning or I'm going really fast, to just sort of come back into the body and see if I can feel all the way into the base of my spine. Take a breath and hold that, what I would call grounding, to gain more perspective. And that's a real, like, that's a real practice for me personally, because most of my life I've just gone with, like, riding my joy. I sometimes joke to my friends, I'm like, now, at this time in my life, my challenge is making sure my energy matches all my creative desires, right? So in the morning, it's important for me to do my practice, and that's typically sitting meditation, it's chanting, it's opening to what I describe as divine presence and asking myself to be in service to it. So we talk about seva, which is service, sangha, which is community, and sadhana, which is practice. All those things will help to nourish our field and our health. They're like the trifecta, like, they're all important.
How much
Um,
time are you devoting to that in the morning?
Sadhana, not too much actually these days. But it's like, it's bits and pieces. So in the morning, it's like maybe half an hour. Would love for it to be like more like an hour. Sometimes it is in the evenings. It could be more like that. But sometimes I sing too, which I would consider a sadhana. I'm a singer. My love for vibration really came from my love of singing. And so for me, singing is sadhana. It's a way to reconnect with myself vibrationally and run my joy juice, as I say, it's a really important part of things. But then there is that moment to moment reconnection through the day. So for me, what that looks like is when I am unloading the dishwasher, or I'm making myself a cup of chai and I'm standing on the stove. Maybe instead of picking up my phone and checking emails and responding to them while the chai is boiling over, which I can do. I have been known to do
Me too.
that.
Me too.
Right? My husband, actually, who's a wonderful embodiment of sadhana, reminds me like, hey, Shamini, do you think you're trying to do too many things at once? And remember that the data actually shows that multitasking isn't that effective. Let me put my phone down and see what it's like for me to breathe into my body while I prepare the chai. What would that be like? So for me, it's honestly that constant reminder, because my constitution is such. I don't know if we want to get into this, but in Ayurveda, we talk about the 5 elements, we talk about the doshas and kind of ourselves as these embodiments of elemental forces. I'm pretty clear that my elemental forces are driven mostly by air and fire, right? So for me, it's a reminder that the harmony is to get back into the earth, to ground, to touch into the watery flow, which is why singing is so beautiful. So I approach it from that way.
I'm also air and fire. I've been suffering a lot while we're on the road because I can't really sing while we're on the road because I'm in, hotels and other people's houses and stuff like that. And I didn't realize how much I miss it until it's gone. Like there's some elements of my life that I feel like I can't totally express myself because when I'm at home, we have this nice soundproof studio. You can really open up in there, and I feel like I'm not bothering people. And I get really self-conscious when I feel like I'm bothering people. And I have, even when I talk in a normal voice, I'm sure the neighbors in this apartment can hear me right now. There's just something about my voice which I feel like is very penetrating. And that's been difficult. So I can relate to that.
Shiloh, can I offer something? Because I have the same feeling. And now that I'm traveling so much, I'm on the road for the next 2 months, kind of nuts, right? And like you, it sounds like singing is part of my medicine, right? Well, part of it is I'm actually incorporating it in my talks because it brings me lots of joy. And I'm realizing it, like everybody loves to sing together. So I'm trying to bring that medicine into a place where we can actually amplify the field of joy and sing together, partly because I want to sing and I want others to sing with me. But here's one thing I've noticed too. We're also self-conscious about the voice. This is coming up a lot for me with my students and in the teachings and even these keynotes and the workshops where I'm now kind of positioning some of my teaching on this very topic, the healing voice. Personally, what I've realized is like if I'm in the parking lot, like let's say, most of us will listen to a song in the car, we might sing along with it. It's kind of running in our heads. I'll get out and I'll shut the door and I'll kind of still be singing the song softly to myself, not like full voice, but just singing it. And I realize nobody cares. They really don't. Like no one's listening to you that intently. Like, we all think like, oh my God, I'm going to sing. Everyone's going to hear me. No, dude, they're doing their own thing. But it also normalizes things. And I've noticed more people doing this sometimes. And honestly, when I hear someone humming or singing to themselves, I appreciate it. It's like soothing.
Nastya is really good about that. I very much admire that about you. You're always singing. I don't know. You're very carefree about it.
I don't know. I think that there's a real value in being comfortable in all kinds of different environments. And I think that I used to be much more uncomfortable and realized that letting that in and allowing it to blossom creates all kinds of downstream horrors. Because it starts to embody as physical pain, it starts to embody as discomfort, as this anxious buzzing. And I think that it's so valuable to be able to let it go and to say, you know what, this is who I am. These are the things that I like. I'm surrounded by people who love me and even strangers. Like we were at the beach and I was in the ocean and I was singing and it's like, there's people around, but who cares? Like it's such a joyous, wonderful thing to hear somebody singing.
Exactly. So let's talk about cultural conditioning for a moment. How did we begin to think that not sharing what gives us joy is serving anyone? Okay, and singing is a perfect example. Sharing our essence, which is our joy, that's how I experience singing. And that's what I truly think it is. Look, I came to singing at a very young age because I realized that I could sing to myself and bring myself back to a place of peace and connection that sometimes was lacking in my life, right? And I could sing and it would bring me back there. And I've noticed that for most people, when especially if they're singing for themselves, that is the medicine. And then it gets completely twisted, right, into like self-consciousness, and people won't like it, and I was shut down. That's all the conditioning. But what is singing itself? But to me, it's not even a contemplative practice. It's like a bliss practice. I don't know how to say it. For me, it's like it's a tantric practice, okay? It's connecting with energy, moving your fields, coming back into your body, and coming into joy. Now, why would anyone be upset about seeing someone in their joy? We really have to question that. And why do we think that we wouldn't want to see someone in their joy? Like, what's that about, right? That's what the world needs more of.
Absolutely. We had a really interesting conversation with this guy, Rex Reapy, who is a philosopher of personality and emotions. And he had this really interesting structure of the way that he binned emotions. And so he was saying that he saw them as being of varying energy levels. And so you have love, fear. Man, every single time I try to remember this, what are the three base ones? Love, fear. No, pride's the super high energy one. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I'll say this, that for him, love is the lowest energy emotion. And it is the one that is most relaxing, and it is the one that is most easy to experience. And everything else, like anger, pride, disgust, guilt, these are all higher energy states. And the only way that you can diffuse a higher energy state is by finding a lower energy emotion to embody.
Ooh, that's really interesting.
And he has a personality test that he put together where it's like 16 questions long. And he bins off of these 16 questions quite effectively the way that you interact with your emotions and the way that you interact with the world. And he has a presentation where his view is that emotions are arguments for how you encounter the world and how you protect yourself from the things that you encounter. And so he has them as being opposites. So you can't feel love and disgust at the same time. You can't feel
guilt and pride.
Guilt and anger at the same time. You can't feel fear and pride at the same time.
I think it's fear and anger, guilt and pride.
I'm misrepresenting this terribly, but the point is that emotions are a way of engaging with the world, and if you are feeling an emotion, then there's probably a lower energy state that you can return to that is more soothing and calming. And I think that what you're saying about joy and the relaxation and embodiment of something that's really these long, slow, easy vibrations, because in order to sing, you have to relax. You cannot sing and be tense. It feels terrible in the body to sing in a way that's tense. You feel it in your throat, you feel it in your shoulders. And the minute that you can actually relax and let go and go into this really calm state, I think that it spreads out to all the people around you, because I'm sure that you've been somewhere where you've listened to somebody who's singing and they're really worried and they're really tense, and it puts that tension onto you. And you listen to somebody singing who's calm and enjoying it and has no worry about what it is that they sound like, and it feels like a physical change that's happening to you as you listen to them.
It's really paradoxical as a performer too, right? Because you would think these sort of open, loud, high notes and so forth would require a lot of, high energy, but they actually require a great deal of relaxation. So I found that to be one of the strangest things as a singer, is realizing that in order to sing these powerful notes, you actually have to take all the tension out of your throat. And I mean, you of course you have to support your diaphragm and so forth, but your head has to actually be like quite chill. And it's so paradoxical. The saxophone's the same way. Like the high notes require very little air and they don't sound like it. Like when you listen to a saxophone player and they go up in the high notes, it sounds like they're blowing really hard, but it's actually the complete opposite. They're actually just controlling very delicately a stream of air as it vibrates really fast across that reed.
But I think that what I've encountered in a lot of people is that there is this reluctance to look at what the emotional state is actually telling you. And it's kind of like when you have an injury and you favor it. it's the same thing with emotions. When you're experiencing some kind of emotional injury, the tendency is to avoid looking too closely at it because it hurts. If you're feeling
Hence what
depressed,
hence what you guys are calling the high energy state. I'm very curious about this interpretation. It's very cool. It's interesting. It's very different from the way healing practitioners will talk about emotions, because to them, love is what they would call a high vibration state. Okay, so again, how are we defining energy? In the way that we're describing it, it sounds to me like we're talking about the energy of resistance, right? So anger, these strong, what we call strong emotions, right? Anger, mania, like all of these kinds of, whether it's valence positive or valence negative, right? Those strong emotions, high arousal. So what I'm hearing is high arousal states are being interpreted as high energy states. And with those, like you said, come a cost, a resistance. Even in high arousal states, which some people, sometimes my experience of joy or ecstatic joy is a high arousal state, right? It's not actually the same thing as calm and diffuse, unbounded love, which feels very different for me field wise than ecstatic joy if I'm singing at the top of my lungs, which for me personally.
Hey guys, quick interruption, quick reminder, we're entirely supported by listeners. That means we don't have any sponsors, we don't have any plans to get sponsors, we don't have plans to start selling you tchotchkes or pills or anything like that. So help us make that dream a reality. Come and check out our Patreon page, patreon.com/demystifysci. We have a really close-knit inner circle there. It's not culty, it's just a discussion group. We get together once a week, and I'd love to see you there. You can join for as little as you can possibly manage, $1, $2, a fistful of dollars. Whatever you have will go a long way to making sure we can put more and more of our time towards this project. So I'll see you at patreon.com/demystifysci. Enjoy the rest of the conversation.
It's a both and. There has to be relaxation in the body, but there has to be a willingness to allow movement and strong movement to happen. Okay. For me, if I am singing an Iron Maiden song, it is different from me singing a Joni Mitchell song. And personally, I love both. I enjoy both. But I will say, and maybe it's because of my small frame, and maybe people of my small frame shouldn't be singing things like Iron Maiden. I don't know. But even when I trained as a coloratura soprano, like, yes, there was a sense of effortlessness, but there was also a certain amount of just physical energy that it took to produce those kinds of sounds. It's musculature, it's everything. And you're right, like the deeper you go, the higher you fly, the more relaxed the body, the more grounded you are, the higher notes you can get because you're not pushing. And that's real important. We teach people this all the time in the workshops. You're not pushing at all to get that big sound. But there is an opening, an allowance for a broader amount of energy to come through the body when you're making big sound. That's my experience. It's just not the same. And then with something like Joni, it's nuance. It's a real attention to subtle nuance in the sound of the voice. And yeah, for sure, when you hear Iron Maiden or Joni Mitchell, your visceral experience is very, very different. It's very different. So to me, it brings us back to the voice being a reflection of consciousness. And what I find when I'm teaching my workshops is that most folks have an issue with their voice because they have an issue with who they are and how they're showing up. And so if you work on that and you allow people to feel fully in their voice, even dare I say, like their voice, and be okay with singing out loud with people, it'll totally shift the way they interact with the world. I mean, do you guys agree with that? Do you notice that in your work?
well, I mean, the idea that somebody wouldn't like their voice is wild because that is, in some ways, the most basic and fundamental way in which you encounter the world. Like, this is, sure, you can be present in a room and you can have problems with the way that you look or whatever, but your voice is the way that you interact with most people. And to have a dislike of this fundamental presentation that you have of yourself in the world just seems so crushing. And
I find it really, like I love recording music. So I started recording music when I was like 14, but I definitely remember the first time I listened to myself after I recorded myself, and I was like, whoa, that is not what I thought I sounded like. And so I feel like being a person who constantly listens to myself played back, I've developed a comfort with my own voice. But I feel like for a lot of people, they're not sure of what's happening totally. Like they don't know how it's being received. If you don't hear, it's very hard to hear yourself while you're talking. And so I think there's this this ambiguity of not knowing that people in general who aren't recording themselves all the time might not be, at ease with as much.
I think that that's actually a really interesting point, because there's one thing to exist in the world, and there's another to be able to step outside and to see yourself existing. And I think that there is something really valuable about being able to match what you want to present yourself as and what you're actually presenting yourself as. And so any kind of attentional practice that allows you to really compare those two things, to be able to tune more closely into it, I think is insanely valuable, because if you're trying to achieve something and you're just aiming in a completely wrong direction, you'll never make it. And so this sort of recording yourself and listening
we
to your
got back
voice.
from this tour. We were going to make a record of the songs that we'd kind of worked out over this tour over the spring, and we recorded it, and it was really interesting because there was some good stuff, but like there was a lot of stuff that we wanted to change immediately after we heard it played back. And it's crazy because we'd been playing it every night on the road for a month, and it was like, oh, okay, that's what that sounds like after all. Oh, that doesn't have to be there. This could change. I'm not projecting this part as much, or this is projected too much. And there's something about once you fix those things and you realign your intentions with what's actually occurring, then when we went to play the next show, we had so much more confidence. And I don't mean in necessarily a prideful way, but more just relaxed confidence. Like, oh, okay, I'm at least making what I meant to make, and I know that I'm doing that much. Like, people might not like it, but, at least I'm doing what I mean to be doing. And I think that crossing that gap is behind a lot of this.
Yeah, this is beautiful. I feel like there's such a deep conversation here that we're having as artists who craft sound with an intention of facilitating an experience in someone, right? And what it is that we're trying to express. And if you don't mind, I'd love to share a little bit of what my journey was like to put this debut album together.
By the way, it's freaking awesome. I was listening to it again this morning, and I just think it's really beautiful, and it's really the kind of music that I love. It's cosmic. There's distorted guitars. There's delicate moments. There's this cosmic Eastern vibes on the back half of the album too. It's freaking awesome. Everybody should check it out. Kali Yuga Blues. It's on Spotify. Yeah.
Thank you. And yeah, shout out to my producers and my mixer, Kyle Mangles, who just, I got to listen to it recently on headphones because I'm on the plane all the time. And I was like, let me give this a listen again. And I was like, oh, this mix is so good. So like, shout out to them for mixing it up. Really,
it really is. It really is.
But my journey with that, and again, I want to tell everybody, look, long story. I don't know if we're going to get into the whole story here, but I grew up singing. I got kind of discovered by my voice teacher and like chorus teacher actually in high school, who figured out I could sing. Took me on a journey to train classically for a few years in high school. I trained as a coloratura soprano in Western classical, never did Eastern classical, which I still hope maybe one day I'll be able to dive into somehow. But long story short, my perfectionism with the voice, which I know we're talking about, right? Your discomfort with the voice. I was so perfectionist about it that I stopped singing for 15 years because I decided if I'm not going professional, then I'm not doing this. And there's no point, right? Which was sucked. And we can talk about that. But
can I just say that that's really common? Like, I have so many friends that I was doing music with 20 years ago who have just completely abandoned it because they're like, if I can't devote 10 hours a day to practice, it's not worth doing at all. And I'm always just breaks my heart a little bit, honestly.
Well, so I want to tell people this because please do not do that to yourself. I lost a huge part of myself for so long. And when I was making this album, my producers, who are wonderful, I'm going to give a shout out to them too. They're the brothers Corin. They, toured with Pink, all the things. They have these beautiful programs where they teach people how to really align and connect with the voice. They'll help people write songs. They do so much beautiful work. And they really, really encouraged me to just be as authentic as I could, because I came in like that trained artist, again, kind of trying to shed that conditioning, but that conditioning was really in there, listening to it. Oh, well, I don't know if I like this. I don't know if I like this. They're like, Shamani, just go into the feeling. Just feel the song. Feel the song. Express the song. Don't worry about whether it's this or that. Don't. And honestly, with some of those songs, are kind of fiery and sad, right? And then when I listened to it, I was like, whoa, that's a lot. Like, it's kind of like, whoa, that's a lot. And, my classical training is like, but that's kind of scratchy, I don't know if I want that scratch, but they're like, but Shamani, it's raw. Like the song is raw. Like just be with what the song is wanting to express. So it was this, what is the song? Not even me, right? But like, what is the song? As artists, we're channels. A lot of those songs were channeled. They weren't even necessarily about my life. Some of them were, like Safe Space, that first song on the album was my rage at, Roe versus Wade being overturned, and my anguish about how I was going to explain it to my daughter. The war against women, the patriarchy, like it's all in there. And all of a sudden it just downloaded. So I had to really tap into that and be okay with what was there. It's a very raw, visceral song for me. But then there were other songs like Told Ya, which wasn't my experience, personal experience, at least not in this life. Like that, I haven't had the experience that came through with that song, but I had to give into it. And so back to emotions, in the contemplative traditions that stem where I come from, in the Vedic traditions, the Jain traditions, Jainism is my spiritual home. A lot of those teachings, Anastasia, back to what is the value of emotions? They would say emotions get in the way of liberation, right? They actually taught us that we need to transcend the emotions. And then there were all these interpretations about what that meant. What does it mean to transcend the emotion? Because a lot of people felt like you have to negate the emotion. Back to, do we have to negate our emotional expression through the voice? I don't believe we do. I believe we have to be present to what it is without indulging it so much that we keep running the same grooves over and over. Like, what did that song teach me? What did that whole album teach me? Well, a lot of it was, there was a lot that wanted to be expressed. There was a lot of rage, there was anger, there was sadness, there was wonder. All of it was there. And the next album for me is probably going to be very different, because I'm now in a different place, having been able to allow myself to go through that creative journey. And you see it now, even in like modern pop artists like Beyonce, really reaching to try to cross genres. Like, do we have to stay in a box? Do we all have to sing rageful metal for the rest of our lives? Or, or fluttery sweet tunes for the rest of our life? Can't we be all of it? I mean, that's what our emotions are teaching us. We're all of it.
I think that there is a real strangeness in meditative practice where it does seem to imply for a lot of people that the goal is to escape emotions. And I worry that that's an impossible goal, and also a really damaging goal, because these, Rex's perspective is that they're arguments. My perspective is that they're actually deeply rational experiences. It's not, when you're angry or you're happy or you're sad or you're prideful or guilty or whatever, these are things that are telling you about what's important to you. And it is a measure of how well you align with the way that you see your position in the world. And if you're experiencing a lot of really high valence negative emotions, that's probably really meaningful. And the goal is not to just shut yourself off from them and to just hide them away, because I think that in turn creates a tremendous amount of agony down the road, because it's like not using a muscle. It's like not circulating the lymph fluid because you're injured and you're trying to favor the spot. It's like, no, you have to lean into it and you have to figure out what it means and what it's saying and how you're going to deal with it. And that's a difficult thing, because I feel like meditation is very much detachment and observation and letting go, as opposed to unpacking and experiencing and fixing.
I think it's a both and in my experience. And I want to make reference to a dear friend of mine, Reverend Tiffany Barsotti, who is no longer with us in human form. And today happens to be her birthday as we're having this conversation. So she's been very much with me today. She used to say, mad is me accessing determination. So if we think of emotions as energy, and we can think of anger as being a high energy state, right? It's a high arousal state. Then we can come into a sense of observation with our sadhana, our practice, and say, anger is arising in me, right? I am not anger. It's the identification that's the issue. So this is where I feel like it's really a both and. Yes, we can sit in our groundedness beyond our conditioning and notice the conditioning arising, because from this perspective, emotions are attached to aversion, ignorance, and attachment. Okay. The emotions are basically a reflection of attachment, aversion, and ignorance. And that's why they arise. So that's why in the non-dual sense, it's like, oh, well, this means your conditioning is being activated. Okay, cool. My conditioning is being activated. Okay. I'm being triggered. So what is this anger telling me about, like you said, the relationship with my values, what I think about myself, how I think this person is being perceived? We can first notice the anger arising. We can take a moment to reflect on that and then say, what is the information behind this high energy state? And then we go into that reflection period, and then we say, how do I choose to respond to it? So I do feel that the contemplative practice of sitting and noticing is a very valuable first step, but that high energy state is sort of like you need to do something, right? You either have to explore how you're going to narrow down and use this fire. Again, I feel like I feel emotions as elemental forces. Fire is arising in me. That means that I either have to use that fire to move in a particular behavior or get more clarity, transform that fire as light to shine some light on a situation that deserves my attention, right? There's something going on, like you said. What is the information in this emotion?
Yeah, definitely. To go back to what you were saying a little bit earlier, you said that you stopped singing for 15 years. What was the path back to it like?
Joyful and sad when I realized what I had lost, but because I let myself cry through that and kept going, I continued the joy. And the way it happened was I had children and I started singing to them out of my joy, which was always what brought me back to it. And as I was singing to them, lullabies, whatever, mantras, I was like, oh, I miss this so much. And then there was the grieving and, oh my God, how could I have let this go? And then a very funny story about what brought me back into performing, because for me, because I kind of grew up doing performance in high school and in college and stuff like that, I've always linked singing with performance in a way. Whereas my husband's a musician, he plays for himself first and foremost, right? He plays because he loves music and he's ingrained in music. Music is just him. He's so connected to it. I kind of grew up singing for myself, but also in performance. So for me, I had to continue my practice in performance. And that brought me a lot of joy, like the interpretation of it, the full force singing of it, the being in a musical community and kind of vibing and the chemistry of a band and stuff like that. So it really brought me back into my joy. And it was a real spiritual learning point for me. Long story short, I came back into singing to follow a dream that I had that I never did, because I sang in like musical theater and some classical singing and things like that. But I always wanted a band, and I never really did it. Like I did some of it in high school and college, but I didn't have my own band. And in my late 30s, I started a Guns N' Roses tribute called Nuns and Moses. And like as part of that, I dressed up as Moses, and my compatriots who were all straight men dressed as nuns, all to my like behest, right? I convinced them to do this crazy thing. It was just nuts. I was in San Diego at the time, didn't know that there was a huge rock and metal tribute scene in San Diego. I was just doing this for joy because I always wanted to sing Guns N' Roses, honestly. And my healing teacher had once said the path to enlightenment was through the ridiculous. So I thought, well, I'm well on my way with this project, super fun. It was just a blast, and it ended up being kind of successful. We ended up being a Jeopardy question, all these things. But all of a sudden, then people were like, hey, can you sing this? Can you sing this? Do you want to try this band out? And then I found myself singing in an Iron Maiden tribute for several years, which was phenomenal because the musicianship was incredible. I'd never heard the music, so it was super fresh for me. I'd never listened to metal, really. I was more of like a classic rock, hard rock person growing up. And there was like all this epic storytelling. And, again, because the musicianship was so spot on, we got to play in these really beautiful big venues with lots and lots of people. And y'all know this as performers, right? What is it like when everyone is singing together at the top of their lungs in joy? I mean, it's just pure ecstatic joy. And that was my experience with it. And it was just that was so wonderful. I talk about this a bit in my book because it ended up not being energetically very sustainable for me. Anastasia, as you were saying, for me with a small frame, it was difficult for me to do that kind of singing and not tense the body. And so I was actually driving myself into some funky health patterns, which weren't good for me. And I was told very clearly I had to let it go. And that's a long story, so I don't know that we need to go into all that personal story, but some of it is in the book. But it was a beautiful kind of like kapow back into the singing world.
It's crazy because do you know about the singer from Iron Maiden?
Bruce Dickinson,
Yeah.
of course.
He's
Yeah,
a crazy dude. That guy actually he left singing too for a while. He became like a commercial airline pilot, started his own brewing company, like
oh yeah, he
crazy
loved.
dude.
Well, they've been on tour, look, for decades now. And what I appreciate about them is they're constantly making music. They're not some of these folks that are doing karaoke of themselves from 30 years ago, but like, God, it's like almost 50 years. I don't even know like how long they've been touring, and new music, which is good music. I mean, I definitely became an Iron Maiden fan after singing the songs for so long and kind of really getting deep within the epic storytelling and stuff. And he went through his own journey with head and neck cancer and had to take off for a few years. I wonder if it was the full force singing that he had to do for so many years because it's, it's real high energy, high arousal type of singing. It's not a joke to sing that stuff over and over, no matter what your frame is. But yeah, I read his book, What Does This Button Do? Great book. One thing that I was curious about was that he really didn't talk about the mystical aspects at all. Like he didn't share his mystical life. And I understand that like a lot of them were deep into Aleister Crowley and some of the occult work. And, it's just, you listen to their songs, it's all there. Like Revelations is all about the Kundalini. Okay, if you read one of my favorite songs to sing, because it's so clearly about energy and liberation to me. But they don't talk about that, which is interesting to me. I'd actually love to sit and have a conversation with him about it, but I've never reached out to him personally.
It's really interesting.
You should. Yeah, that'd be interesting. I'll listen to it.
Cool to see. I think that there's something about people coming together to make something that's incredibly powerful too. Like I think about this in terms of music, where if there's one person singing, even if they have a lovely voice, even if it's the most beautiful voice, there's something about having a group of people singing the same thing that transforms it. And the band is the confirmation almost that whatever is happening is worth listening to, because it's not just one person with a guitar on stage. It's already all of these people that have bought into the phenomenon that they are producing together. And then that allows you to pull others into it, and then everyone can relax into this space and just enjoy it. And, not everybody has the capacity maybe to form a band, but I think that the thing that everyone can learn from it is that the most satisfying thing in the world is to be working with a group of people on something that you all believe in.
Oh, so true.
And most of those relationships that we have right now are through work. And I think that oftentimes people are working on things that are not deeply meaningful. Like they have a job, but the job's just kind of okay. And so cultivating those experiences where you have a group of people, and maybe it's just that you're organizing dinner parties. Maybe it's just that you go on hikes together. Maybe it's that you have a book club. Whatever it is, having a group of people that are bought into something and they're nurturing it and they're caring for it is, I think, a clear path towards this biofield healing, and that doesn't necessarily have to have an external practitioner that's involved.
Oh,
because it's all of you creating it together.
it's a field effect, right? So beautiful. When you were speaking, Anastasia, I had the recollection of a quote by Khalil Gibran. Work is love made visible. Work is love made visible. Were we all to have this experience of work being something that is an expression of the love within us? Lots of people, what's my purpose? I say, well, your purpose is just to be. Your purpose is to be in your love. And if we're lucky, whether it's what we make money at, or whether it's something that we do out of the sheer joy and passion, our quote side project, we all have our day jobs, whatever. I'm grateful that my day job is something that I'm really passionate and about, and it's very much this thing. When we began the nonprofit Consciousness and Healing Initiative, we did it to build community, because we came together as a group of people who really cared about this. We actually cared about science. We actually cared about exploring this science, and we were in this minority where tenured professors, major universities couldn't feel like they could talk about consciousness in their work, their day jobs at the university, where they have multi-million-dollar grants to study things that the NIH has deemed important and necessary. And yet they're finding all of this amazing stuff and they want to pursue it, but there's no community. So, Consciousness and Healing Initiative developed to help support these scientists first, to be that community, to talk about things that we loved, even if it was just with no agenda. Like, of course, as the leader of this, my goal was to source $25 million to help scale the scientific research in the way that it needs to be done. And we still have that need today. We have not been successful in raising 25 million yet, but we've made tremendous impact. We really have, as a community. And part of that has been publishing data, publishing gold standards for how to conduct research in biofield therapies for clinical care, reports on how to move the levers of change to integrate these kinds of practices into healthcare, self-care, community care. A lot of things that we've done as a community, but that community expanded. And that's what I think the field effect is really about. When you get together, whether it's about safety in schools, whether it's about how to take care of your children or your elders, like whatever that thing is about, that field of coherence actually grows. There is data behind this too. And I'd love to wax on the data because I think it's really important. But there is data that shows that when we come together around a common value or a practice, we actually experience coherence. This has been measured with what we call hyperscanning studies, where we can look at the shifts in EKG coherence, EEG coherence. There are a handful of studies showing that when we have coherent behavior and we have coherent physiology, it will actually predict cooperation. Okay, again, this is studies in PLOS One and other decent journal studies. Okay, beginning to demonstrate that when we come together in coherent behavior, we can facilitate cooperation. We're more likely to cooperate. When we're more likely to cooperate, we facilitate a better world. So therefore, internal coherence, group coherence, increased cooperation, greater possibilities for co-emergence, what I call co-emergence, or novel new behaviors that emerge from the whole. And, not to get all crazy, but this stems from complexity. Okay, so if I can, I just want to go backward with this, because this is something I'm super passionate about now that I'm telling people about. This is why what you're saying about us coming together is so vital. We are all saying it's chaotic. It's like chaotic times. So what is chaos? Chaos is a high energy state that is actually very ordered. We think it's disordered, but that's because there's so much going on that our perceptions feel like it's disordered, but it's actually ordered. We understand that when we look at fractals. Fractals are a reflection of what we call chaos, and yet there's order. Within chaos is what scientists have called the edge of chaos. This is an extremely high energy state where the systems don't necessarily fully lock together, but they also don't wither away in complete disorder. This is complexity. And what we know about complexity is that it's the interconnections between systems. So again, it's not top down. It's not the brain informing the body, right? We know now from physiology, there are interconnections between the immune system signaling the brain, as an example, right? Everything is talking to each other with strong feedback, not just feed forward, because then entropy occurs, right? Feedback mechanisms through the interconnection that create coherence. And with more coherent behavior, we have more likely opportunities for emergence. This is actually all math, okay? So I'm talking about it more in the behavioral social science perspective, but some of this emerging data that we're looking at with physiological coherence is bearing out this perspective.
Does coherent just mean, does it mean like higher amplitude, less variance? Like what does that mean?
We look at it in terms of synchrony. Okay. And again, synchrony doesn't, or coherent, I'm sorry. So there's synchrony and there's coherence. They can be different. Importantly, when we look at coherence, let's just say from EEG, and we've done some of these studies where we've looked at EEG coherence between meditators, okay, to see. People talk about, body-mind coherence, coherence of brain signals with heart signals. Is there such a thing between coherence between brains when people meditate together? We saw some preliminary evidence of that. We have a report on our website, Consciousness and Healing Initiative, that has the full report on it. We would want to replicate that at least 6 times before we actually publish it in a scientific study, and we haven't gotten to go back to India to replicate it. But it was really interesting, and there are other people that have replicated this too, in different conditions, not just meditation, actually with singing together, dancing together, like coherent behavior, okay? When we measure that, we're looking at basically whether or not there is a correspondence, a connection between waveforms. The waveforms don't have to be in phase. So it's not like the sine waves are in concordance. They may be, they may not be, but you can look at one point on the EEG and another point on the EEG and see whether they're actually moving together. So coherence is moving together. And if we want to kind of wax philosophical or social on it, then it's like, oh, if this is a principle, if coherence is moving together, but not necessarily the same, then it means that diversity helps provide the fodder for co-emergent behavior. So if we can actually come together and entertain different perspectives and hold those perspectives and move together, holding the perspectives instead of fighting in a resistant state, if there's no resistance, but there is just more information, a complex system has more information, coherence provides the opportunity for more information to emerge. You see how this can work, right? And if we apply that to sort of our social thinking and what this handful of data, and I will say it's handful, right? In hyperscanning studies, coherence and cooperation is telling us, then it's what everyone is saying needs to happen, you guys, right? Decreasing polarization of thinking doesn't mean that everyone has to think the same way. It actually just means that we have to adopt the multiple ways of thinking and say, I think like this. You think like this. Is it possible that both could be equally true? Shoot, that's mind-boggling for most of us, right? It really is.
Well, that's what makes a really good band too, right? Or a really good piece of music is you have all of these parts that are seemingly completely off on their own tangent, right? I mean, I don't know. There's no point in pointing out any individual band or artist, but I think that art has that vibe where even a really good film or piece of literature, it has one cohesive wave that crashes over you, but then if you can read a really good piece of literature, a really good poem, listen to an album again, and you hear new things. You hear, oh, this one person or this element is doing this one pattern which overlays with this other pattern to give this coherent, I don't know, experience. Yeah. And I think that's what I find that I love about all of my favorite art is that I can keep enjoying it on new levels over and over and over again. And I can step back at the same time and just hear the whole thing too. But there's something about the nuance of these collaborations, whether it's wave collaborations or individuals themselves or just themes in a piece of literature or a film.
Have you collected subjective reports from people about what the coherence feels like for them?
Great question. I want to do more research myself in the area of coherence. When we did that study, what we did was we time-stamped on the EEG signal what they were doing, what was their practice, because they had different kinds. This was done with our collaborators at the Sri Aurobindo Ashram in Pondicherry, India. So they have their own practice and their own process. What we noticed was that increased coherence was happening when their inner experience was to actually go into the interior. So it wasn't that they were trying to connect. They were actually going into the inward experience. So look, physiologically, we could say, well, how do you know it wasn't that they were all somehow breathing the same and that created EEG coherence? Because that could happen. We don't know, actually, because we didn't measure breathing, sadly. We could infer it from the heart rate variability, but whatever. Their experience was one of tending to the internal, and their experience of when they do that is that the field opens, right? This is their description of what's happening. So what is happening? We don't know. A lot of people, when they come into group meditations, will say they're opening to a field. So it's not that they're intending to connect to another brain, but the field is informing them. They're opening to something broader than the conditioned mind. We don't know, right? That's hand wavy. Scientifically, we have no idea. No one's really looked at this deeply in terms of what the phenomenological experience is during coherence. There are some studies within meditators where they're looking at different states of meditation and what's happening. But from the interpersonal coherence point of view, it's wide open to look at.
Do you have any sense of what it might be or things that you're looking forward to testing? Because you said earlier that you think that it's not necessarily an electromagnetic phenomenon.
I suspect that what is happening is this opening to the larger field again. And we actually tried to do some measurements of that too. Like, are there field changes? I actually had wanted to do the REG and get Dean Radin's REG apparatus into this. We used another measure, which is a novel measure, which I won't even talk about. It measures kind of changes in the ionosphere, and we saw some evidence for potential fluctuations there. But I think there's field changes happening. That's what I would say from a scientific point of view, that I think it's not just an internal, but there is a field change happening that could potentially be measured in the room or in the space. So scientifically, I'm interested in exploring that and linking that with the phenomenological experience of, are people opening to what they would say is a broader sense of consciousness beyond the conditioned mind, whatever that experience is.
It's interesting because when we were talking to Dean, he kind of had a similar take on it where he was like, I don't really know how to explain this. Like, we don't have a model of the physical world that this can fit into, but we've collected enough data to show that it's happening. And we've also talked to other consciousness researchers, like, do you know Christoph Koch?
Of course, yeah. I mean, I don't know him personally, but I know of his work.
And so we had Christoph Koch on the show to talk about his new book, which is called Then I Am Myself, the World. And he's a really interesting character because he made a massive transition from thinking that it was all materialism all the way down. And then he had a couple of really cosmic experiences. And now he's much more in the idealist realm where he's like, there's something that's out beyond us that perhaps we're able to tune to. And it's interesting that everybody who's studying this seems to be on the same page, that there's likely something that we're tuning to, but no one really knows what that is. And until we can figure out what it is, it's really hard to build a detector for something that you don't know what it is. Because if you're looking for an electromagnetic field, you build an electromagnetic detector. If you're looking for an ionic field, you build an ionic detector. But if you don't know the field that you're looking for, you're kind of just... you're in the desert a little bit, wandering, trying to figure out what that could be.
It's so true. And I love that you brought up his story because it's a really relevant thing in science to discuss. How much does one's personal experience guide their hypotheses, their way of thinking? And is there any such thing as not being biased as a scientist? When meditation research started taking real wind, decades ago, there was a lot of pushback from the scientific community that meditators were doing the studies because they said they're biased. they're bought into this meditation thing. When probably people would say that about me with energy healing, because I have learned how to work with energy as a practitioner. And I do say that I have experienced energy as a meditator, which brought me to wanting to study it scientifically, and as a singer. So Christoph's experience and his bravery in being able to say, I thought this way, then I had this experience, and now I'm really wondering about this, to me is the best way of the true scientist saying, I don't know. And maybe there's something to experience guiding the exploration. It doesn't mean that the way I think about it is right, but my experience is going to guide me to ask certain questions. I mean, even study what we study. In psychology, we always joke, like we come into psychology to heal what we didn't heal, like the questions that we have are based on whatever it is that we needed to heal in the past. And that may be true for a lot of psychologists. It's no different in any science, really. Our curiosity comes from somewhere. And it usually comes from experience. And then the questions we ask and our hypotheses and the things that we want to disprove are based on things that we're curious about, based on our experience. I mean, it's just that simple. So you can never really have a fully objective science, and this is why replication becomes so important. And, that's a whole other can of worms. I don't know what to get into. There's a lot of debate about how replicable studies are. And it's interesting to me that more often than not, as I understand it, I'm not going to give statistics because different people give different statistics, but more often than not, if you have another scientist try to replicate another scientist's work, they don't replicate it. What's going on?
I mean, I think that there's a lot of people seeing things in data that they need to be able to see in order to publish. Look, we've both worked in labs for over a decade. You've spent a lot of time in laboratories. You know how this works. You do something until you get the results that you want, and you throw away all of the other trials where you didn't get the result that you want because you can justify why that trial didn't work.
I mean, to me, that's bad science. I'm sorry.
That is the baseline. Like that, nobody does science in a way where they do one experiment and they're like, this experiment works every single time.
No, you got to replicate it. And ideally, you have other folks replicate it. But the social aspects of science are important to name here, Anastasia, and you did. I got to get the grant. This wasn't what I said I was going to get in my hypothesis. This is an interesting but extraneous finding. I can't go down that rabbit hole, even though I'm seeing a replication of this extraneous finding that I didn't expect. I saw that as an undergraduate at Columbia University. We were studying memory, and there was this damned weird negativity that would occur before the person saw a target thing. So we were looking at ERPs, event-related potentials, studying memory, and we had targets and non-targets, right? And we were looking to basically just look at memory, conscious memory. But the weird thing would happen, and we saw this over replications where before the target would arrive, the person's brain would show a negativity, but not for a non-target. Okay. Now, Dean Radin has done research on this and actually showed that this is related to what he calls precognition. But we were studying precognition at Columbia University, and my very esteemed professor said, that's weird. And he let it go. Right? It was like, oh, well, this has nothing to do with what I'm studying. Right. So I'm not even going to look at this. But this file drawer thing where it's like, I'm not seeing what I want to see, so I'm just not going to publish this data. This is a real problem, right? A documented problem in science. And I will say, for us, we have published negative findings. In this field of biofield science, it's essential. We have to, because we don't understand what we're looking at. And if we don't publish the things that didn't work out, we're not going to learn anything.
I mean, my experience with it, the way I made peace with it was we did a lot of experimenting in the early phases of the research. And then once we discovered something interesting, I started referring to it as demonstrations. So what I would be perfecting in the lab from a technical standpoint was how to demonstrate the discovery that we'd made during the experimentation phase of the research. And it's annoying because people call those demonstrations experiments, right? Because you're running replications on things and you're doing statistics and all of this. But the reality was that we were just refining the demonstration of a discovery that we had made in an experimental phase that wasn't really part of the paper at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, the way that even scientific papers get written is it's a bunch of experiments that are done at different times in different orders that are then sewn together to tell a story of a linear process of discovery. But the linear process of discovery is never linear. It's just that's a fiction. That's a convenient fiction that we put together because
Makes it digestible for the reader.
it makes it super digestible. Because if you actually reported the insane approach that you took to figure this thing out, it would be like, why did you do it that way? That's completely crazy. But we need stories. We need something that we can hang our hat on. And I think that the need for stories often takes over and egos get in the way. And there's a huge phenomenon in research, which is the idea of hands, where there's like one person who can do an experiment in a lab and they can do it reproducibly.
Especially in biology.
Especially in biology. They can do it reproducibly, they can do it perfectly, and no one else can.
Well, look, pipetting like is a skill. I will say I did not have it. I was told really early on, like, well, let the lab folks do the Shamani. You're just not a good pipetter. You want to reduce error, right? Like, there is something to someone who has the beautiful hands who can actually replicate pipetting just the right amounts because we want to reduce that error in the measurement. And that is important. Like, that's valuable. The magic hands are valuable. Magic in this case to me is, can you replicate that? One thing that I learned from one of my mentors, Dr. Gary Schwartz at the University of Arizona, who was one of the fathers of behavioral medicine and then came into great scrutiny because he started studying crazy things, quote, crazy things like survival of consciousness after death. Okay, like he really, he went all out. But he was the one that started demonstrating these effects of emotions on, on the heart, like way back 50, 60 years ago or whenever it was. And he mentored folks like Richie Davidson, who everybody knows is, one of the big researchers in mindfulness. He's mentored a lot of really amazing scientists. And one of the things he taught us was to layer your experiments, your design, in a way that the first layer is the sort of the conventional. Here's my hypothesis. Here's how I'm building to the body of knowledge. It's important that in science, we're really, even with this biofield work, y'all, we're not trying to throw out anything. We're just trying to see, we're replicating and extending. That's how science progresses. So we have the conventional thinking. In my own randomized control trial, the question was, can placebo predict these effects in energy healing, right? So that's the conventional. Then you have the controversial, right? Which is, in my case, with that study at UCSD published in Cancer, could energy healing have effects over and above placebo on cancer-related fatigue, which was my primary outcome variable? And then the super controversial, which for me was, can energy healing potentially affect physiology? Something I know nothing about, right? Big question mark. I don't even know if I'm going to see anything here. It's a wild shot. Like, I have no clue. But the healers are saying that they can affect physiology. So there's some anecdotal evidence that's guiding a hypothesis. But personally, as a scientist, I have no idea. This hasn't been studied much at all. I'm just going to look at it for fun. That's my tertiary hypothesis, right? And then I look at it. And so this is, I think if we can build studies in this way, where we always stay grounded with, this is my primary outcome variable, this is what the statistics are, do for them. We apply, alpha control, all the things that, I did Bernoulli in my case statistically to make sure that if I'm going to have different hypotheses that I'm powered to do it. If we don't build in the novel, you don't even have to call it super controversial, but the novel, I'm just going to open to an idea. In my case now, we're just completing the data collection on a randomized controlled trial with sound healing for anxiety. It was born out of some initial feasibility work we did in COVID, where people were shut in their homes, they couldn't access care, and we knew that these groups of practitioners were out there delivering care in this way. They were actually performing sound healing over the phone. It's a whole thing. I could explain what they're doing, but they were saying people got better. And I was like, okay, well, let's just study whether we can even collect the data. and like whether people will just do this, will they actually engage in receiving an intervention? And is there any signal of an effect on anxiety? And what did their spoken language say? And what did they say qualitatively? And we published all that. There's 2 papers out already on that. We saw a signal and people would do it, and there was a low dropout rate, right? So then we powered for a randomized controlled trial. We just collected data on our 100th person, 2 groups with the health education control, and again, the same kind of process for people who meet criteria for generalized anxiety disorder. And we're using the same metrics, the state trait anxiety inventory, the perceived stress scale, the positive and negative affect scale, all gold standards. We're measuring changes in affect and spoken language, born out of some wonderful work that our colleagues at University of Arizona have done with many different trials, including in psychedelics and meditation. What do they say in their own words? But then we put just something super novel in, which I don't expect to see anything in, but I'm curious to just see if there's any signal. And that's the microbiome. Can we collect the data? Might we see any shift in just a person's perception of anxiety and their microbiome changes? And is there any kind of signal, if I even have enough data to look at this, that a shift for people who receive the sound healing is different from people who receive the health education control, right? So I love to sort of build out the I don't know as an exploratory variable in my analysis. And, I personally, all the scientists I know, like it's good science to me to do that, as long as you're powered for it,
Have you done the analysis on that experiment yet?
No, we can't wait to dig in. No, we're just cleaning the data now, and we hope to publish it. We will publish it next year. So I'm super excited, and I'll be happy to relate to you what we find. And of course, we will be publishing it, whatever it is.
That's fantastic. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about how to figure out the quality of practitioners, because with something like energy healing, I feel like there's a lot of people out there that say that they're healers, let's say, but I imagine that there's probably a gradation of skill and ability.
Yeah. I get asked this question a lot, as you might imagine. It's like, how do I know who to go to? How do I know who's legit? So I have a few suggestions for folks that are looking for healers. The first is, and I will not stress this enough, go with your gut. Okay. Not the only thing, because you want to look at data too, but you really want to go with, do I feel a resonance with this person? Look, the data is clear. When we feel a connection with our practitioner, whether it's an MD doctor or a healer, an energy healer, that sense of connection will foster more positive outcomes. Okay. So there's data behind that, which we can talk about if we want. But that's number one. The second thing is to see if you can, like you would with anything, right? Look for reviews, talk to folks who have worked with the practitioner, and interview the practitioner. Understand whether their process has been that they've been certified. Like, for example, healing touch practitioners go through a very rigorous training program. We're part of their certification process. They have a certification process, several different levels of training. So you can ask them what level they've trained in, like what their clinical hours were in. They actually have supervised clinical hours, of practice on particular patients. So you want to ask all those questions and kind of gather data. Have you worked with folks with my condition before? What do you think? But don't discount your inner knowing as part of this, because you really are working with, whether you want to call it the subconscious fields or whatever. So you want to pay attention to that as well. And, if you have the opportunity, explore, because all of these practices are a little different. Pranic healing, healing touch, different forms of sound healing, they all approach it a little differently. Just like you might decide, what kind of meditation do I want to practice? But above all, remember this: that practitioner is, no matter who it is helping you heal yourself. So remember that. And if anyone is like acting, if you get any kind of culty vibe or funnel vibe, well, do this and then that'll unlock the next thing. And, now you're at the next level and you must join my program, or back off. Okay. That's not what healing's about.
That's good advice. Yeah. I mean, I feel like what people really are after is someone who will pay attention and connect to them.
Which is rough. Like, I cannot uh, overstate how important it is to actually see somebody face to face, like I don't know about Zoom, but like in person. Like I watched a ton of YouTube videos when I was trying to figure out my back before, and I just could never make heads or tails because I wasn't talking to a person who could listen to my personal experience and immediate feedback, not just talk but touch also, and like, oh, this hurts when I touch you here, or when you move this way. And just a few minutes with the right person can make up for hundreds of hours spent trying to read books or watch videos and learn this stuff on your own. That was really profound for me.
Which is really crazy because it seems to be something that once you learn how to hold yourself or your body or your attention,
That's all it was.
then you can start to practice it and become stronger and more attuned to it over time. And it's not necessarily, because I think that's something with healing, like with psychiatry, I often feel like it's a permanent treatment plan.
Same with healthcare management system, whatever it's called.
Yeah, it's like the idea is not that you're ever going to be independent of the practitioner. The idea is that
Real problem. That's a real problem. It takes me back to the days that I was a graduate student at UC San Diego, and we took a psychopathology class with the medical students. And the resident was telling everyone, including me and all the medical students, that if a person was diagnosed with one major depressive episode, they would have to be on antidepressants for the rest of their life. I was shocked. The data didn't even support that. I was like, what are you talking? I mean, I just literally in small group was like, what are you saying? Like, that's not true. Like, there's no evidence to actually support that, and we kind of went to bat on it, so there is this brainwashing, and I will call that there was this brainwashing by the pharmaceutical industry to make people dependent on medicines outside of themselves. And yet, there is real data on our own ability to help foster healing and maintain a healthy state. That's our actual nature. But so yes, we will see practitioners to get help because sometimes we can't get out of our minds, or we don't realize what our habits are doing to us, or we need help getting through trauma. Like, it's not easy to untraumatize yourself. Okay. I don't recommend it for anyone. Like you said, Shyla, you sometimes, whether it's back pain or psychological trauma, you need someone to be there and hold the body and the space. Like, that's essential. But a good practitioner will help you be on your way so that you don't feel dependent. This codependent phenomena in healing, and
I think you can be really honest with the healers that you visit too. And like this guy was like, oh, how long are you in town? Like, because he realized I was pretty messed up right when he first started examining me and talking with me. And I was like, look, I can't afford to come back here. Like, this is my one visit with you, so I need to soak up all the knowledge right now. And he was kind of like, whoa, okay, that's a very different approach. But he's like, I think I can still help you. Like, and he did. Like, it was actually, honestly, he did like work on my body a little bit, but it was more a knowledge transfer session. And I had to be, I think this is true with any doctor appointment or anything. You really have to go in with knowing what you want to get out of the experience and kind of be prepared to meet the person halfway and make sure that you're able to extract what you need from it. Like, what a terrible way of putting it. But yeah.
But people, we look at to practitioners as miracle workers, like fix me now and fix me in one session. And typically if something has gotten into the physical system, there's a whole pattern to undo. And sometimes it takes some time to build the insight even to help us heal ourselves. So it's like whether you're going to a psychotherapist and expecting that all your trauma is going to be released in one session, or a long-standing physical issue, it's like, well, come on, it's not just placing an unnecessary expectation on the practitioner, but also on yourself. Like, part of illness is, we view illness in the whole person health field. When we talk about healing, what is healing? Healing is a restoration to harmony. So this idea of dis-ease is coming out of harmony. And first of all, we have to kind of figure out how we came out of harmony. That takes some time, sometimes to figure out, okay, what is disharmonious? And then how do I restore harmony? And this is the beauty to me. This is the magic of whole person health, is that it comes back to the complexity in whole systems thinking, right? There are multiple paths to restore harmony and restore health. And so there are
hold on 1
many
second.
ways that we can explore and enjoy the path to healing. Our diet, our lifestyle, our social relationships, our relationship with our own mind, our relationship with our body, our relationship with energy and spirit. All of it is relevant. But if we go to one practitioner one time with a fix-it model, it's unrealistic. And I would say you're not doing yourself service. Now, you brought up a good point, Shiloh. I don't have time and I don't have money. Okay, most of us are in that position. We don't have time and we don't have money. We've got to make the time, and we have to figure out how to enrich ourselves with what we can do. And so that lesson that you had, the knowledge transfer session, how valuable.
Yeah, and so much of it reminds me of the beginning of our conversation. We were talking about listening to recordings of ourselves singing played back, and so much of my interaction with this one particular person was them looking at me from the outside and assessing what I didn't see. Like, he actually recorded a video of me. And he's like, "Look, your back is crooked. Like, you're," and making me comfortable with, okay, it's going to take me a long time to actually build up the strength in the oppositional groups that I need in order to restore myself to a more centered posture such that I'm not misloading my spine in this way. And like, that's going to take you a long time. It's going to be a lot of work, but it's totally up to you. If you want to do it, you can do it. And he just kept, at every junction, like, well, you can fix it. It's up to you, and you can put in those hours, even if I can't go and have somebody massage me every week, I can learn what I need to do from somebody who can look at me and look at my body and my experience. And there was the spiritual element to it too.
But I think that this is why pill-based medicine is so popular. Like, it's easy to point to the insurance companies, to the pharmaceutical companies, and yes, they've played a massive role in making this the case. But I think that people get to a point where they just want to be better. They want somebody who can give them something that will immediately fix it. They're tired, their nervous system is frazzled, they feel like they don't have the time or the will to complete some kind of healing program. And so the market has responded to that desire where you want a pill. You want something that will be the quick fix so that you can go on with your life doing all the things that you're doing, because that's just what's easiest and that's what's most accessible.
Created that reality, though. The market created that reality, right? How did we come to decide that we don't have time or energy to take care of ourselves or do the things we love because we are being fed some kind of crazy story about what it means to be worthy? Produce, produce, produce. Make, earn. Rat race. Okay?
Where's that heading too, right? That's something I would find myself obsessed with.
It's not sustainable.
Where's it going? Like, why are we trying to build faster and faster and faster supercomputers and all of this? Like, is there anybody driving this machine? Like,
okay. Do we want to go here? Because
here's
this is
fascinating to me, right? I mean,
we're sitting in the belly of the beast right now. Like, we're sitting in Silicon Valley, and everybody around us is doing AI. Everybody's talking about AI.
We're about to go to a dinner party tonight with a bunch of AI researchers, and it's kind of that's my fundamental question: is like, what is the point? What is the goal? Like, what are we actually?
May I offer perspective?
Yes, please.
Like, an overemphasis on certain principles of our being. Okay. And I know some of my gender studies folks are going to get really pissy when I say masculine, feminine. Okay. But I'm going to invoke those terms for a moment, because there is something about fundamental principles of what we have labeled masculine and feminine. We've labeled those things, right? Certain attributes. In Chinese medicine, they talk about yin and yang. In other traditions, the masculine, the feminine, the wounded feminine, the wounded masculine, the divine feminine, the divine masculine. Lots of different ways people describe this, okay? Whatever you want to call it. And for now, I'll just use these terms, okay? Masculine, feminine. This masculinization of our way of being, which relates to what has often been called yang energy, the doing, the preciseness, the mind, the influence on science, specialization, beautiful. Like, I'm now specialized, and I'm not a generalist, though. Now we're seeing a movement towards generalism, which is great, but like typically it's like drill down, drill down, drill down, faster, faster, an emphasis on the mind, and just sort of this movement in this direction. Logical, precise, reason, all of these things. So throw away emotion, throw away sensation, throw away embodiment, throw away this concept of energy. Like, all of these things actually relate to more of the feminine view, a more holistic view of things, the interconnection between things, what we call feminine. Again, in Chinese medicine, some of these things are related to what we call yin, the going within, the emptiness, the silence, the quiet, and sure, the observation within it. So these things have to be brought into balance, right? And our beautiful native brothers and sisters for millennia have the story of the eagle and the condor. Maybe people are familiar with it, right? The idea, in essence, that you must balance the masculine and feminine aspects of ourselves. So we see this playing out right now in the gender of men and women, leadership, equity, the quote war against women's bodies. Like, we're seeing all of that played out in society, but it's also an internal process for each of us to say, do we want to move in this direction? And I would say that some of the negative aspects, I don't think masculinity is negative at all. I think it's beautiful. It's an incredible aspect of our being. But this toxic masculine business, which leads to scarcity mentality, more and faster is better, go to the point of exhaustion, has been driving our society in an unsustainable way. It's related to what we call too much feed forward mechanism, which leads to collapse. Okay? That's what the math tells us. Feedback systems only work when we give space for feedback. So in the context of our body mind, if we hold more of the yin space, the feminine aspect of sitting in silence and not doing anything, paradoxically, more gets done, actually, because the mind is actually not in the way. So we kind of get out of our way. And manifestation, I hate that word, but manifestation, for lack of a better term, things happen without us having to effort so much, right? That's absolutely true, because there's an emergence. The way of doing becomes different because there's more of an emergence, because you're allowing for connections to happen without driving one pathway.
That proves to be absolutely the case, because I tend to have this vision that if I just, this day of the week comes around and I'm like, I could do so much if I stayed home and just caught up on things. And I've had a tendency to do that. We both have in the past, because it seems like, if we just worked a little bit harder, we would somehow catch up. And the fact of the matter is, you never ever catch up. There's always more work to be done. And when we don't take that day to go we don't do a lot when we go in the woods. We'll go swimming in the river, maybe we'll just sit and have a conversation. But there's something about that which is extremely profound, that regenerates the imagination for all of the projects that are on your plate, where you can actually approach them effectively, as opposed to just grinding and grinding and grinding away at all of these things, which you do care a lot about, and you want to put that time in, you want to put that effort in. But if you're not, but paradoxically, by stopping working for a dedicated amount of time, you actually get the vision that you need to effectively do the work. It's very, very strange and hard to remember.
And it's really interesting to connect it back to something like working on AI or working on longevity research. You talk to the people who are working on this stuff, and you ask them about their vision for what the future will look like when these things have come to fruition. And they rarely have a really solid sense of what their technology is going to do to the world, or what they want the world to look like once the technology is implemented.
Ooh, that's tough. That doesn't make me feel good to hear, especially that latter part, because for me anyway, the vision of what we want to see, for example, with our work, the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, has always guided the actions and the steps. The vision must guide the action. Otherwise, it's beautiful. Look, science for science sake is beautiful. The mind is a beautiful thing. But if they are being driven by subconscious patterning that's trauma informed, you know, leading us to an unsustainable and unequitable future, there is no point. It's not just indulgent, it's dangerous. Okay? Like, it's dangerous. So, this is why the mind must be balanced by the body. This is why coming into an embodiment in a felt sense, again, as we spoke about in our earlier part of the conversation, the returning to the field, to know that we are conscious creators of, a field. We're part of the field. And so we must return to the larger whole to be informed by sensible steps to guide the stewardship of the whole. If we're not doing that, what are we doing?
So, what is your vision for a world that is healthier and more functional? From all of the data that you've collected and all the experiments that you've done, what do you think would be a more beautiful world?
I really see much of what we've discussed today as really being embodied in the world. Connection, sharing joy, sharing passions, not feeling alone, getting the help when we need it. All the things we want to see. With respect to this work in the field, what it means is an ability and permission for us to return to that field of connection and coherence to help realign ourselves with our world, with our planet. I truly believe that returning to the field, as it were, whether it's through interpersonal connection, connection with nature, connection with animals, connection with ourselves, is what's going to guide us to be responsible stewards of our planets. But first, we have to begin with us. We have to heal ourselves. And the resources that we're providing, I hope, will give people the hope and empowerment, the knowledge, the grounding to understand how real and possible this is. And then what I see are honestly networks of leaders. We have so many people in our community that are incredible leaders in their own right, that are sharing their passions, their joy, their fascinations with healing, what they're learning. I mean, this is what's the beauty of the human experience. Absolutely, the mind, the exploration of it. But that we all kind of step up as leaders of ourselves, leaders of our families, of our communities, and our planet, that we're not handing over our power to a few people in charge.
And what do you think is a functional practice for somebody who's just setting out on this?
Thank you for that. Would we like to engage in a practice? Would you like to do that?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, that'd be a good way to close it out.
Yeah, okay, great. Let's do it. Nothing like putting it into practice. Sangha, right? Sangha, community. That's what we've been building here. And sadhana, practice. So, whatever your practice is, whether it's to close your eyes when you like to kind of drop in or keep them open and kind of nicely focused on a place in the room, just allow yourself to do that for a moment. And just come into your awareness of your breath. It's the first step. No right or wrong way to breathe. Just breathing. Just opening to the breath. Perhaps placing the focus on the tip of the nose and the air coming in and out of the nostrils, just as a place to rest attention. Just resting attention on the nose, the nostrils, the flow of air. Mind doing what it does, it's fine. We can notice the mind and still be here with the breath. And perhaps entertain the mind now with an exploration of sensation in the body. We may notice that the mind wants to go to a particular place in the body. And just let it go there for a moment. You may be a place where you're feeling a lot of sensation or a place where you're not. But holding a focus on the breath and noticing where the mind may want to notice sensation in the body. Where am I being pulled to at the moment? And now just open to that. Wherever that place is, in or around the body, open your spaciousness to that point. That is to say, breathe into it. Loving, touching breath. Opening, welcoming, breathing, allowing. The inflow and outflow of the breath. Perhaps you notice this as tightness or spaciousness, whatever words come to mind as you're breathing into this point or points around the body, in the body. Just breathing into it. Thoughts come and go, and you're still here breathing. And now, wherever that place has been, see if you can play and connect a link with that place in the center of your chest, in the heart area. And explore what it's like to bring your attention to this heart area in the center of the chest. Breathing and allowing. Breathing and letting go. honoring the presence of you. And as the mind does its thing, as it does all the time, remember this presence of you. Remember the breath that nourishes every cell. And know that returning to presence is always a practice that you can enjoy at any time. Giving thanks to yourself for engaging in just a few moments of touching into your own presence. When you're ready, if you've had your eyes closed, you can open them.
That was lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess we can just end it there. I mean, it's been very generous. I know you don't usually do these long conversations, and I really appreciate you making the time for it. And I'm sure everybody else listening does as well.
It's my joy and my honor. You guys are so wonderful to speak with, and I hope we'll cross paths on tour. I hope we'll get to catch a show of yours. Let me know if you come out to the Carolinas or California.
Will do. And thank you to Jeff for putting us in touch and making sure that this happened.
Yeah, very much. Thank you, Jeff. If you're listening. Many, many blessings and gratitude for all you do in the world.
All right, Shamani. Yeah, we'll let you go and enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you so much.
All right. Thank you both. Blessings. And have fun on tour.
Thank you. Good luck with everything that you have ahead of you.
Thanks.